Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Thousands of Turkish women took to the streets last night to mark International Women's Day.
This year's International Women's Day demonstration in Istanbul took place in the central district of Taksim, where thousands of Turkish women gathered to demand greater women's rights and to denounce violence against women. There was a heavy police presence in the demonstration, which included female officers. Earlier in the day, security forces had set up barricades around Taksim Square, which marks the eastern end of the Istiklal Avenue. Despite heavy police presence, the rally was allowed to proceed peacefully. The women chanted slogans including, "We are not silent, we are not scared, we are not obeying, and women are strong together." Women's rallies were also held in Ankara and the southeastern province of Diyarbakır. According to the Platform to Stop the Murders of Women group, 339 women were killed in Turkey in 2017 and 76 so far this year. The situation of women in Turkey is much below average. There is no freedom, not only for women, but for anyone, one protester said to Hürriyet Daily News. Despite that, we are hopeful. That's why we are here, she added. The world would move if women had freedom, but they don't let us be free. Every day there is pressure. We have had enough, added Türkan Gezmiş. The situation of women here is a disgrace. It is getting worse, she added.
Tonight we're joined by Aslı Çarkoğlu and MaryLou O'Neill from Kadir Has University. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. To talk about their recent survey titled Perceptions of Gender and Women in Turkey. We'll hear about the survey first, and then we'll be back in the studio to talk about your findings.
Kadir Has University's recent poll on the perception of gender and women in Turkey was conducted on February 23rd across the country with 1,205 people, including women and men. According to the poll, 61% of the respondents believe that violence is by far the biggest problem that women face in Turkey as of 2017. In last year's poll, the rate was 55%. The respondents also voiced demand for policies to fight violence against women across the country. Unemployment and lack of education follow violence, with 9% of all respondents believing that both constitute major problems. Street harassment, parental pressure, and gender inequality are also listed among the biggest problems that women face in Turkey. Some 72% of respondents said they believe that domestic violence is a valid reason for divorce. The poll also touched upon the presence of women in Turkey's labor force. Some 28% of the female respondents said they are in active employment, 35% said they used to work in the past, and 46% said they have never worked before. According to the poll, 84% of the female respondents and 73% of the male respondents agreed with the statement that women's participation in labor force is essential for the country's wealth. Meanwhile, some 64% of women and 49% of men said muftis should not be able to perform and register marriages. A draft law allowing muftis to perform official marriage was submitted to the parliament in July 2017 that was strongly criticized by opposition parties and women's rights groups. The poll also found that both men and women believe they should have equal rights and opportunities in the public sphere and in their private lives. However, the poll underlined that these attitudes are mainly limited to women's rights and opportunities in the public sphere and not reflected in their private lives, particularly when it comes to childcare, abortion, and household work.
Welcome back. So let's start by hearing more about your survey. I'll turn to MaryLou O'Neill right now. So can you tell us a bit more about the scope of the survey, the participant profile, how many respondents were there, etc.?
Sure. The survey was administered in late January and early February. 1,205 people over the age of 18 participated. It was administered in 23 provinces across Turkey. It's considered a 92% representative sample. It was administered by Frekans Research Company. If we look a little bit more closely at the actual participants, an almost even split between men and women, 51% women, 49% men. A pretty good age split as well, 49% between the age of 18 and 35, 51% 36 years of age and older. The average age was 39. If we look at education, the majority of the people in the survey, 44%, had either an elementary school education or a middle school education. Still 7% of people, at least in this survey, with no kind of diploma at all. High school education, 30%, 6% for past high school, and then 13% for university. If we look at the gender split of education, it gets a little bit more interesting. We can still see a gap, a gender gap between the education rates of men and women, at least of those people who participated in this survey. 48% of the women who participated had an elementary or a middle school education, while 40% of the men had that same kind of education. Once you get past high school, the gender gap starts to close in terms of education. Majority of the people who participated were married, 68%. The remaining participants were either single or divorced or widowed. 88% were parents of some kind, and the average number of children was 2, which is in line with the birth rate in Turkey these days. So a pretty representative sample overall.
So let's start talking about your findings now. Your results suggest that violence against women is a shared concern, actually, among both men and women, and it's also identified as the biggest problem faced by women in Turkey at the moment. In fact, 61% of your respondents said that they believe so. Is this a new finding, or have the results been this way in previous surveys?
We have been conducting this survey with very similar items for the last 3 years, and we had the same kind of ranking for the last 3 years. So in 2016, 2017, and 18, most of our participants said that the largest problem in Turkey for women was, or the most important problem was, violence. But what's different this year is that that percentage significantly increased. In 2016, the percentage of the people who ranked it as number 1 was 53%. Then it rose to 55%, and this year it jumped up to 61%. So in that sense, we can say that it is the number 1 agenda item for larger number of people right now.
I realize this actually isn't one of the central parts of your survey, but still it's worth discussing at this time. What do you think are the main reasons behind the increase in violence against women in Turkey?
Well, of course, it's a multivariable thing, but most likely, we're thinking, first of all, the attention being given to violence against women in Turkey has increased immensely in the last couple of years. On the other hand, we do have reports of increasing violence, actual violence reports towards women as well. In the last 2 months, since in January and in February of this year, 73 or 75 women were actually murdered by someone they know. And this kind of coverage and discussion, last year we had many instances of young girls being victims of abuse, or women being victims of violent abuse in the media. So this kind of attention seems to be doing its job and turning people's attention to violence against women.
So the problem of violence against women, according to your findings, is followed by unemployment, according to the respondents, actually. And what do your findings suggest? What can you tell us about your findings about women and the world of work?
Well, the second, largest problem, although at a very small 9% of respondents saying that the problem of unemployment for women is actually a problem, is an issue in and of itself. The fact that we don't see unemployment as an actual problem for women is, I think, something we need to start to talk about. The number of women who work in this country is actually very low. TÜİK, the Turkish Statistical Institute, released statistics on women this week. 32.5% of women participate in the labor force, which is tremendously low. I mean, if we look at Europe, About 60% of women are participating in the labor force, so Turkey's at roughly half. I think the other thing is that having a job and having an income also, we see from other research tends to reduce, the amount of violence women see. Mostly because, well, what we know is women who have less education and women who have a lower income or no income tend to be, more often be victims of violence. And if nothing else, a job or an income, well, education can get you a job, and a job hopefully provides some kind of income, and then this might open a door for a woman to get out of a violent relationship. There's no guarantee here. Plenty of wealthy, well-educated women are also victims of violence, but I do think it can provide some opportunity to at least entertain the idea of getting out of that relationship. So we certainly need to start to talk about the issue of unemployment. Now, the other interesting thing in the survey is there's lots of support for women working. Men support women working, women support women working, and yet we still have a disconnect because women in this country don't work in large numbers. And so we have to start to talk about why women aren't working, what are the real sort of, difficulties there. And I think once we can begin that discussion, then perhaps the pathway to work might open up.
We actually have some idea of why they don't work in a very, coming from a very different type of question. Well, not too different, but we ask women if they're working or not. In our survey, about 28% said currently they're working. For the ones that are not working, we also ask, have you ever worked before? And when we added up the numbers, about 41% of our sample never worked in their lifetime, never in their lifetime. So what the small percentage that remains between the currently working and not worked at all, we also asked them, what made you quit work? And what we see in that is that there's a significant percentage of women who say that they quit working because they needed to care for the family and the kids. Because in Turkey we have very little governmental support for childcare, very little governmental support for elderly care, and most of this care duty is left to the women of the household, which makes them vulnerable in two ways. First, they have to do the job, but also having people dependent on them for their care makes them hard for them to leave the relationship that's abusive as well. So it's a no-win situation for most women in that sense.
Let's get to a different section of your survey now, which is women's attitudes towards politics in Turkey. There are some quite interesting data in the findings. For instance, more than 75% of your respondents, both male and female, have said that women can lead a political party, although this figure is much lower when it comes to voting for a female future president. So what do the other findings suggest about women's attitudes towards politics in Turkey?
Well, there's actually a lot of support for women entering into political life, both by men and by women this year. 76% of men, and 80% of women responded positively to a question on whether or not they thought women entering into political life would affect politics in a positive way, affect society in a positive way. So there's a lot of support for women joining parties. We also ask, should more women actually, enter parties and become politicians? Again, 66, 2/3 of men saying yes, 79% of women answering yes. And each year we see a decline in the number of respondents who support the idea that politics is just for men. So we're down to 20% this year with the idea that somehow politics is still just for men. So I think there's a lot of support now for women joining political parties, including running political parties and serving as party leader. But yes, as you pointed out, women support the idea of a woman candidate for president, at least this year. 70% of women said they like that idea. Men are much less supportive. Just 30% of men said that they would prefer a woman presidential candidate.
Did you want to add something?
No. Just maybe one thing. We also asked if their choices for political party, which party they're going to vote for, is affected by the women's agenda for the party, such as how many female candidates they have, or if they have anything to say about women's unemployment. The thing that kind of got my attention is that the issue of women's unemployment and the party having an agenda for that became a much more important issue for women. About 58% of the women said, yes, we would like them to have an agenda as such, whereas it was about 43% last year. So it kind of is something to watch for. We have another year behind in front of us to see if that becomes an important issue for parties to think about before elections.
And before we wrap up, what are some of the other important findings in the survey that we may have perhaps overlooked?
Well, it does sound, when we talk like this, it does sound like things are getting better for the case of women in Turkey. However, we do also see yes, there's a lot of support for women's participation in public life and in the workspace, but there is also an increasing support for more conservative family values. For example, having kids out of wedlock, living without a marriage contract became really problematic issues for this group. They did not, about 80% did not agree with those kinds of statements at all. And their ideas about abortion is rapidly changing. That's your area, MaryLou.
Yeah, there's very little support for a general right to abortion anymore in this country. I mean, what we can say is that 64% of our respondents, same as last year, support the right to abortion, but only under certain circumstances. Medical necessity in the case of incest, in the case of rape. But we saw substantial increases in the number of people saying that abortion is a sin or that it's the taking of a defenseless life. 63% this year, up from 55 last year, saying that it's the taking of a defenseless life. And of course, another large decline in the number of people arguing or supporting the idea that abortion is a woman's right, and so it shouldn't be prohibited. In 2016, 44%. Last year, 43% supporting this idea, down to 36% this year. So a rather substantial decline in in support for the right to abortion, despite the fact that Turkey has quite a liberal abortion law. I mean, it is a right in this country. Since 1983, it's been legal. It's legal, it's available, it's covered by the state health insurance. And yet, it appears that societal attitudes are eroding in terms of their support for that right.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight here in the studio, Aslı Çarkoğlu and MaryLou O'Neill. We'll continue with our next video now on gender inequality in the labor force in Turkey.
A recent article by Ayşe Buğra from Bosphorus University, published on the Science Academy's popular science platform sarkaç.org, shows that women's participation in the labor force and political life in Turkey is extremely low. According to the data discussed in the article, Turkish women's labor force participation rate stands at only 36.2%. The same rate averages to 63% in OECD countries. Moreover, the unemployment rate among women in Turkey is 14%, while the same figure stands at 9.8% in OECD countries. 40% of working women in Turkey are not covered by Social Security and therefore forced to work informally. The same rate, however, is 29.3% for men. The article suggests that one of the main reasons for gender inequality in the labor force is related to the inequalities in access to education. According to the data, the average period of study in Turkey is 8.8 years for men and 7 years for women. The global average for women, on the other hand, is 7.7 years. Women's political participation is another focus of the article. The data suggests that only 14.9% of deputies in Turkey are women, while the global average stands at 22.5% and the OECD average is 27.7%.
The Egyptian media reported this week that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has described Turkey as part of a triangle of evil.
Saudi Arabia's powerful crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has described Turkey as part of a triangle of evil, along with Iran and hardline Islamist groups, Egypt's Al-Shuruk newspaper reported on Wednesday. Salman's comments were made to local editors during a visit to Egypt this week. According to the report, he accused Turkey of trying to reinstate the Islamic Caliphate, abolished nearly a century ago when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Saudi embassy in Turkey dismissed the report as false. His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, was referring to the so-called Muslim Brotherhood and the radical groups, the mission said in an online statement. Turkey is a staunch backer of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is banned in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Iran and Turkey are seen as competing with Saudi Arabia for regional supremacy. The 32-year-old Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Egypt this week as part of his first foreign trip since his appointment last year.
Moody's has downgraded Turkey's debt to Ba2 from Ba1 on Wednesday.
Rating agency Moody's downgraded Turkey's debt rating on Wednesday, lowering the country's sovereign debt rating one notch to Ba2 from Ba1 with a stable outlook. The government appears to be focused on short-term measures to the detriment of effective monetary policy and of fundamental economic reform, Moody's said. In its report, Moody's cited faltering institutional strength as the primary driver of the downgrade. Moody's also highlighted the continued erosion of Turkish institutions, along with the retention of a state of emergency more than 18 months after the coup attempt. According to Moody's analyst Kristen Lindow, this overall picture suggests that the possibility of a sudden, disruptive reversal in foreign capital inflows, a rapid fall in already inadequate FX reserves and, in a worst-case scenario, a balance of payments crisis, while still quite low, has increased beyond Moody's expectations a year ago. However, Moody's decision of downgrading Turkey's debt was disregarded by Turkish government officials. The decision has no reputability at all. Today, the markets had zero reaction to the Moody's report. The Turkish economy continues its growth path with a strong structure and high quality in public administration, Finance Minister Naci Ağbal told the reporters. Turkey has undergone a series of downgrades by rating agencies in the wake of the failed coup on July 15, 2016. Moody's had also cut Turkey's rating to a sub-investment grade Ba1 in September 2016. Moody's recent decision leaves Turkey's credit rating 2 marks below investment grade.
Turkish singer Atilla Taş and journalist Murat Aksoy were handed a jail term of 3 years for their suspected links to the Fethullahist terrorist organization, FETÖ.
Istanbul's 25th Criminal Court handed a jail term of 3 years, 1 month, and 15 days to Taş, and 2 years and 1 month to Aksoy for helping the organization knowingly and willingly, while not being a part of the hierarchical structure within the organization. The two were arrested in April last year, while charges against them were dropped in October after they spent over half a year behind bars. During the same hearing, 23 other suspects were handed jail terms ranging from 6 years and 3 months to 7 years and 6 months as part of a probe into FETÖ structure in media. They are accused of being a member of a terror group and participating in a coup attempt. Turkey accuses FETÖ and its US-based leader Fethullah Gülen of having orchestrated the defeated coup attempt of 2016, which left 250 people killed. Meanwhile, the 6th hearing of the Cumhuriyet trial, where 20 defendants are tried, is being held today in the Silivri province of Istanbul. Among the defendants are Editor-in-Chief Murat Sabuncu, Chairperson of the Executive Board and Attorney Akın Atalay, reporter Ahmet Şık and Kemal Aydoğdu, who are currently under arrest. The defendants are charged with supporting the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party PKK, Gülen Movement FETÖ, and the outlawed Revolutionary People's Liberation Party Front DHKPC. Prison sentences requested by the state prosecutor range from 7.5 years to 43 years.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
Jennifer Cardini will be on the decks at Mama tonight. She will be followed by Just D and Günce Acı. After more than a decade spent building an enviable reputation for herself in the clubs of Paris, Jennifer Cardini has become an international concern. Her infectious charisma and versatility behind the decks has led to invitations to play at such famed night spots as Panorama Bar, Nizza, and Fabric. And with her creative platform and label correspondent very much on the ascent, her standing as a tastemaker is as prominent as ever. Notre Dame de Paris musical is finally coming back to Istanbul after 3 years to perform at Zorlu PSM between tonight and March of 25th. Notre Dame de Paris is the classic love story of Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, revamped into a modern stage production by Luc Plamondon and Richard Cochante. Audiences all over the world have fallen in love with the show. Parafilm's March program is saluting women in sports. The selection presents a diverse range of stories of female athletes with astounding stories. From fiction to documentary, the program Gold Medal, Women in Sports, explores the strength and stamina of incredible women. Personal Best captures the electric atmosphere of the 1980 Olympic trials. Venus and Serena gives an unprecedented access to the world-famous tennis players' sisters. Sarah Prefers to Run tackles the anxieties of a young athlete who lives only for the race. And New Generation Queens focuses on the story of Zanzibar's determined women's soccer team. Know My Name is being screened tomorrow at 6 p.m. and Personal Best on Sunday at 6 p.m.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.